Now, we got 22, 23, and 24 of 2 Samuel, and we're diving into 1 Kings, which will be the death of David and the increase into Solomon. And before we do that, we'll watch that film. But that's if we get through everything first. If not, that way at least we have enough for tonight. There's one little thing that Pam pointed out that I did not catch, and I was going to show you all. There was, what's his name? Remember him? Who was going, David was going to give him the opportunity to go live with him. And he says, no, take this gentleman as your servant. See if I can find it. I should have keyed this up first. His name was Chinham. Hold on. Where was that at?
Can't you type the name and come in?
Somebody sounds ill. Was it 21? I think it was 21. Since giving us some excuses for the Lord to give you in Lord's Mountain. I wanted to show it to you, but I guess I'm having trouble finding it. I just thought about it. I should have keyed this up beforehand, but it just came to my thought. Going to battle with, oh, well, whatever it was. The guy, remember the old guy? He says, no, I'm going to stay in my own place and die here, but you can take this other guy named Chinham. Well, Chinham was actually the old guy's son, not a slave or a servant. And so I just I missed that. So, and it's like I'm missing where it was in scripture. Okay, never mind. So let's flip. Chapter 22, 23, and 24 are a little odd. Things just kind of seem to be all scattered through here, bits and pieces, almost like when they found these things, they just kind of added them to the bottom because some of it goes back a little ways. 22 actually is a copy of, one's a copy of the other. I would think maybe they took the Psalm 18, which is on the right side of my page, and for the most part inserted it into chapter 22. And just like it says here, David proclaimed the words of his song to the Lord when the Lord had rescued him from the grasp of all his enemies and from the grasp of Saul. So this is David writing in the Song of Thanksgiving to the Lord for that. The reason why I have these up here like this is just going to show you that it's really interesting. In chapter 22, everything, pardon me, too many Cheetos, everything highlighted is an exact match. And I went down through half of it because it was taking me forever. I just wanted to show it to you just as an example. And anything that's not highlighted is it's just a little bit of a change. As you can see, not much, as I kind of had to scroll through both of these to just give you an idea. In fact, this is all exact until you get down to verse 12, and it's pretty much the same thing. He made darkness cover about him. He made darkness his cloak around him. Massive water, heavy thunderheads, water, dark and storm clouds over here. Hope y'all can see my mouse. I should turn that a different color so it's not white on white. Just to give you that idea that this is basically Psalm 18 in chapter 22. Okay, now what we're going to do is come back up to the top, and there's a notation right here, and it does a good job of explaining the breakdown of this Psalm, or chapter 22. And what I did was I took those notes and I put them over here. So hopefully you can you read it's a little bit smaller. Can you read the notes on the right side? Okay. I know when you have a phone, it gets a little bit small. So it says here that this chapter 22 is the Psalm of Thanksgiving, also appears in the Psalter, which I just talked about. In both places, it's notated in them from the writings that it is from David. And two main sections can be distinguished. And in the first part, after an introductory stanza of praise to God, which is 2 and 4, which 2 starts up here and says, he said, O Lord, my rock, my fortress, my deliverer, my rock of refuge, my shield, my saving horn, my stronghold, my refuge, my savior, from violence, you keep me safe. And then it goes on with 4, praise be the Lord, I exclaim, I have been delivered from my enemies. And so this is, well, first of all, the word horn, it would be like a symbol from a bowl, and it means strength. There have been pictures, I've mentioned this one time before, about Moses actually being drawn in old medieval artwork, if you will, with wearing horns. It looks kind of freaky, actually, but that's what horn basically means. Now, if we come back over to the right side, it says the writer describes the peril he was in, which is verses 5 and 7. So 5 and 7, the perils he was in. The breakers of death surged around about me. The menacing floods terrified me. The cords of Sheol tightened. The snares of death lay in wait for me. In my distress, I called out to the Lord. I cried out to my God. From his temple, he heard my voice. My cry reached his ears. It's very, the whole idea of what David's doing is poetry, but real life thing that he's going through. But he's a poet. I wonder if he knew it. Okay, so let me scroll up here, and then poetically depicts under the form of theophany. Theophany is like seeing God active, kind of alive or present, if you will, and God's intervention in his behalf. So this is going to be 8 through 20. So let me read 8 through 20. Let me get 8 up here. The earth rocked and shook. The foundations of the heavens trembled. They shook as his wrath flared up. This is God's response. This is what I mean by theophany. It's seeing God act. Verse 9, smoke rose in his nostrils, a devouring fire from his mouth. It kindled coals into flame. Now, obviously, this is all metaphoric in a sense. He parted the heavens and came down, a dark cloud under his feet. Mounted on a cherub, he flew, borne along the wings of the wind. He made darkness the cover about him, a mass of water, heavy thunderheads. Let me scroll up. Verse 13, from the brightness of his presence, coals were kindled to flame. The Lord thundered from heaven. The Most High made his voice resound. He let fly arrows and scattered them, lightning and dispersed them. Then the bed of the sea appeared. The world's foundations lay bare. At the roar of the Lord, at the storm breath of his nostrils, he reached down from on high and seized me, drew me out of the deep waters. This is all imagery. He's rescuing David from Saul's grasp. He rescued me from my mighty enemy, from foes too powerful for me, because Saul was great, had a lot of men, had all of Israel and basically Judah almost. They attacked me on a day of distress, but the Lord came to my support. He set me free in the open, and he rescued me because he loves me. So that's 8 through 20, and that's what we see going on there. And this chapter actually has 51 verses in it. This won't take us too long. Concluding with an acknowledgement of God's justice is the next 10 verses, 21 through 31. An acknowledgement of God's justice. Let's look for this. As you can see, I didn't finish with all the yellow and red lines. The Lord acknowledged my righteousness, rewarded my clean hands, for I kept the ways of the Lord. I was not disloyal to my God. His laws were all before me. His decrees I did not cast aside. I was honest toward him. I was on guard against him. So the Lord rewarded my righteousness, the cleanliness of my hands in his sight. Toward the faithful, you are faithful. To the honest, you are honest. Toward the sincere, you are sincere. But to the perverse, you are devious. You scroll up, 28. Oops. 28. Humble people you save, though on the haughty your eyes look down. You are my lamp, O Lord. My God brightens the darkness about me. With you I can rush an armed band. With my God to help, I can leap a wall. God's way is unerring. The Lord's promise is tried and true. He is a shield for all who trust in him. Okay, so that's 21 through 31. That was his acknowledgement of God's justice. And let me scroll up because we're about to go on to 32. In the second part, because that was all considered the first part that mentioned here about breaking all that down. And in the second part, God is praised for having prepared the psalmist for war. So preparing David for war. So this is kind of a synopsis of David's life when it came to battle. This is only 32 through 35. Preparing for war. Truly, who is God except the Lord? Who but our God is the rock? This God who girded me with might, kept my way unerring, who made my feet swift as a deer's, set me safe on the heights, and who trained my hands for war, my arms to bend, even a bow of bronze. So that's 32 through 35, preparing him for war. And then 36 through 39 is giving him victory over his enemies. And I didn't put that in there, right? Okay. Giving him victory over his enemies, 36 to 39. You have given me your protecting shield, and your help has made me great. You gave me room to stride, my feet never stumbled. I pursued my enemies and overtook them. I did not turn back till I destroyed them. I struck them down and they did not rise. They fell dead at my feet. So, victory over his enemies. And then 40 through 43 was whom he put to flight. Okay, so we'll scroll up. 40 through 43. Put to flight. You girded me with strength for war, subdued adversaries at my feet. my foes, you put to flight before me. Those who hated me, I destroyed. They cried for help, but no one saved them. Cried to the Lord, but got no answer. I ground them fine as the dust on the earth. Like mud in the streets, I trotted them down. So David's proclaiming the greatness of God of letting him defeat his enemies. Okay, two more parts. And bestowed on him dominion over many peoples. And this is 44 through 46. Okay. And if you do have a New American Bible Revised Edition, it would have the same footnote in it if you ever wanted that breakdown too. Okay, so, and bestowed on him the dominion over many peoples, 4 through 46. You rescued me from the strife of my people. You made me head over nations. A people I had not known became my slaves. Foreigners cringed before me, and as soon as they heard of me, they obeyed. Their courage failed. They came trembling from their fortresses. And we can see, the idea of reading all this again, too, is that we're getting we saw all this in 2 Samuel when David was in power. And so we can kind of relate to some of the stories that we heard, what happened with him and the power that he had. And his enemies just coming to him saying, I'll be your servant, those kind of things. All right. And then the last part would be 47 through the last verse, 51. The entire song ends with an expression of grateful praise, which is really a wonderful way. Sometimes we forget, we do get little distracted with our concerns we offer up to God, and we just basically asking him, with a heartfelt request, and we kind of end that way. But to end with praising God, it's a good thing. Does God need to be praised for his own sake? No. God knows exactly who he is. The idea of praising God is just reminding yourself of God's greatness, and that if we ask him for something, it is within his ability, but we also ask for his wisdom and compassion with all that we ask, and his will be done. So 47 through 51, here we go. The Lord lives, blessed be my rock. Exalted be God, the rock of my salvation. O God, who granted me vindication, subdued peoples under me, and helped me escape from my enemies. Truly you have exalted me above my adversaries. From the violent you have rescued me. Thus I will proclaim you, Lord, among the nations. I will sing the praises of your name. You have given great victories to your king and shown kindness to your anointed, to David and his posterity forever. And that concludes chapter 23. Let me hit a button. Okay. I'm putting my chat window up because I figured out how to do that now. And if I do that, then hopefully, in case anybody, where'd it go? Okay, I'm playing. Hold on, messing around here. All right, so that concludes chapter 22. And we'll go into chapter 23. The last words of David. The text of this short composition is difficult in places. It views David's career in retrospect. So we're just going to kind of go through this. As you can see here, it's only part of the chapter. It stops there at verse 7. So we're going to go ahead and just kind of read through it. And it says the last words of David. I should have looked for, it doesn't say this. I would have thought the last words of David would have came out of Psalm 150 because that was the last Psalm. But it doesn't make a notation to that effect. So now this is a one that's from First Kings. No. I'm just checking something real quick. Nope. Okay. All right. Nothing that attaches it to Psalm 150. It doesn't look like a Psalm 150 anyways. So let's go ahead and read this. The oracle of David, son of Jesse. The oracle of the man God raised up. He's speaking of himself. Anointed of the God of Jacob. And, you know, Jacob, of course, was who, like they'll call Jesus the son of David, because David was so great. Well, David recognizes Jacob for his greatness because it's his sons that basically came the 12 tribes of Israel over those 400 years of continued growth, if you will. And so he recognizes what happens is that, no, what was I going to say before my phone went off in my ear? I'll think of it in a minute. Sorry. So he recognizes Jacob as oh, I know what I was going to say. Hey, a lot of times people would say, you know, I worship the God of Jacob, Isaac, or actually Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And they say that because one, God's not dead, and neither are they. They still continue to praise God from where they are. So it's kind of that recognition that they're not gone and have no part in this. Okay, so anointed of the God of Jacob, favorite of my mighty one of Israel. The Spirit of the Lord spoke through me. This is David talking about himself. His word was on my tongue, so showing how much of a prophet David was. The God of Israel spoke of me, the rock of Israel said. And then this is not really, I put it in purple because it's in a sense God's words, but David's saying them. One who rules over humankind with justice, who rules in the fear of God, is like the light at sunrise, and on a cloudless morning, making the land's vegetation glisten after rain. And you've got the last three verses here. Is not my house firm before God? Is he not an eternal covenant within me? Set forth in detail and secured, will he not bring to fruition all my salvation and my every desire? But the wicked are all like thorns to be cast away that cannot be taken up by hand. I'll comment on that in just a minute. One wishing to touch them must be armed with iron or a shaft of a spear. They must be utterly consumed by fire. So it's really interesting that we see in verse 6, it says, but the wicked are like thorns to be cast away that cannot be taken up by hand. In other words, it's very difficult when you had enemies, in the way David might put it, and trying to weed them out. You know, it's that correlation again of the parable of Jesus. You know, you can't pull the weeds. You know, that kind of thing. You wait until that time comes, and how difficult it is to really do that. So I thought that was kind of interesting. All right. David's warriors. Now this is just a reframe. It's nothing new. There's no action going on pretty much in 22, 23, and 24. There's some things going on in 24. It's rather interesting, but it's, again, the time frame here has all been shifted in that sense. So David's warriors, these are the names of David's warriors. I don't know if there's a notation to this effect. There are 37 warriors and all named in this list. There are the 3 warriors most noted single-handed exploits, and we'll go through those. And then comes the story of daring adventure by the 3 unnamed members of the larger group of the 30. But instead of reading all that to you, I will just let you see something here real quick, and I'll pop it up now, and we'll pop it up after we read it. If you look, this is just a little, I was surprised it was actually in here because there's not necessarily a family relation to them, but this is David and his mighty men from chapter 23 of Samuel. And we're going to see how he names out, you know, the 30, how he names out the 3, the 2 that are going to be mentioned that were killed by Benaiah, and the like. So we're going to see a little bit of this in just a minute, and name some of the names that we're kind of familiar with as well if we look through that. And of course, David's here on top. Zeruiah, sister, and of course, her sons Joab, Abishai, Asahel, and some of the other names we heard. Okay, let's throw that at you there real quick. All right, so these are the names of David's warriors. Ishbal, the son of Machamani, chief of the 3, he brandished his spear over 800 whom he had slain in a single encounter. Next to him was Eleazar. This is like rolling credits after a movie. The son of Dodo, the poor guy's named Dodo. Okay, I'm sorry. Ahohite. Ahohites were from Hawaii. No, I'm just kidding. Sorry. One of the three warriors with David at Efshindaman. It's like that should be a cuss word. When they insulted the Philistines who had massed there for battle. The Israelites had retreated, but he stood there and struck down the Philistines until his hand grew tired from clutching the sword. The Lord brought about a great victory on that day. The army turned back to rejoin Eleazar, but only to strip the slain. In other words, take off from them what you can get off of them. Let me roll up here. Verse 11. Next to him was Shammah, son of Agi the Herite. The Philistines had assembled at Lehi, where there was a plot of land full of lentils. So the people were fleeing before the Philistines, but he took his stand in the middle of the plot, kept it safe, and cut down the Philistines. Thus the Lord brought about a great victory. Such deeds as these, the three warriors performed. So we're talking about the three. And do we remember the names of the three? Dun, 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 dun. Jeshoboam, Eleazar, and Shammah. Okay, going back. Verse 13, scrolling up. 3 of the 30 chiefs went down to David in the cave of Adullam during the harvest, while a Philistine clan was encamped in the valley of Rephaim. David was then in the stronghold, and there was a garrison of Philistines in Bethlehem. Now David had a craving and said, if only someone would give me a drink of water from the cistern by the gate of Bethlehem. You know, just get a bottle of Dasani. No, not good enough for David. He had to have the water from this cistern. And there's actually a map for that to show you the distance that they went. Thereupon the three warriors broke through the encampment of the Philistines, drew water from the cistern by the gate of Bethlehem, and carried it back to David. Check this out. He refused to drink it, and instead poured it out to the Lord, saying, the Lord forbid that I do such a thing. Could I drink the blood of these men who went at their risk of their lives? So he refused to drink it. And all three men had the same expression. Okay. You know, it's like, I got the water, brought it to you. Okay. Anyways, that's a really interesting story. I can show you that map since we got a little time to play with. Let's see. This is David's census. This is kind of a neat map. I'm going to show you this in just a minute in chapter 24. The census story in chapter 24 is kind of interesting. Hold on. I really wish this would have been left off where I had it. But no. Come on, come on. Wait, there it is. There we go. Come on up. David. And shows in here. Takes the throne. There it is. Water for David. So they went cave of Adullam and went to Bethlehem and got water for David and brought it back. If you look on the bottom left, the bottom of these two, this one's the 2 mile one. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 4, about 20 miles one way to give David some very satisfying Bethlehem water, and then 20 miles back for him to pour it. But, you know, maybe David just said he would like the water. He never asked for it. I don't know. Let's go see what he said again. Very interesting. He had a craving and said, if only someone would give me a drink of water from the cistern by the gate of Bethlehem. You know, when you're the boss, and even Bishop Duca was kind of like this. He goes, I had to be so careful what I said, because if I said I wanted something, no, Dennis, thanks. If I, you know, Father Bishop Duke would be like, if I just said something, people would act on it. And I was just thinking out loud. And so we kind of had to learn. I imagine that's what happened with David, that he just kind of thought, yeah, wasn't that pretty cool that one time we were in this one place? Remember that water? Oh boy, was that nice and cool and refreshing? And they're thinking, hey, we can do something good for the king. But that was not what the king had necessarily intended. But he spoke it out loud and they heard it. And that's just how loyal the people were for him. And this is the three warriors that we just described. So anyways. All right. Abishai, the brother of Joab, son of Zeruiah, was the chief of the 30. He brandished his spear over the 300 whom he had slain, and he made a name among the 30, but was more famous than any of the 30, becoming their leader. However, he did not attain to the three. So we're talking about Joab, right? Abishai, brother of Joab, Abishai. We're going to remember that name. Hold on a second. Let's see where Abishai was in this dude. He's not one of the three, and Joab or Abishai was not. They were the warriors, but none of them attained this three here. Believe it or not, as great as Joab was and Abishai and everybody else, these three that we haven't heard much of, we heard a little bit of, were the ones who got the big award. Okay. So going to verse 20, Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, valiant man of mighty deeds, and from Kabzeel, killed the two sons of Ariel of Moab. Also, he went down and killed a lion in the cistern on a snowy day. He likewise slew an Egyptian, a huge man. The Egyptian carried a spear. Benaiah came against him with a staff. He wrested the spear from the Egyptian's hand and killed him with that spear. Such deeds as these, Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, performed, and he made a name among the 30 warriors, but was more famous than any of the 30. However, he did not attain to the three. So these guys are runner-ups. They got the honorable mentions, you know, that kind of thing. So they get their own little story in here, but they were not one of the three. All right. Now here's the fun part. Let's see if I can get this to fit. I'm switching over to the English Standard Version. And the reason why is because this goes through the 30 names. And I hired a guy to come on and read this to you. So when it comes up, and I think the sound's going to work, if you hear it playing, give me a thumbs up. And you can follow it word for word in the English Standard Version.
Chapter 23.
You hear it?
Now these are the last words of David. The oracle of David, the son of Jesse, the oracle of the man who was raised on high, the anointed of the God of Jacob,
wait a second.
the sweet psalmist of...
Hold on.
And he struck down an Egyptian, a handsome man. Asahel, the brother of Joab, was one of the 30. Elhanan, the son of Dodo of Bethlehem, Shammah of Herod, Elika of Herod, Helez the Paltite, Ira the son of Ikesh of Tekoa, Abiezer of Anathoth, Mabunai the Hushathite, Zalman the Hohite, Meharai of Netophah, Heleb the son of Baana of Netophah, Ittai the son of Ribai of Gibeah of the people of Benjamin, Benaiah of Pirathon, Hidai of the brooks of Gaash, Abai Alban the Arbathite, Asmaveth of Bahurim, Eliabah the Shaalbanite, the sons of Jashan, Jonathan, Shammah the Hararite, Ahiam the son of Sherar the Hararite, Eliphalet the son of Ahasbai of Maacah, Eliam the son of Ahithophel of Gilo, Hezro of Carmel, Pearai the Arbite, Igal the son of Nathan of Zobah, Bani the Gadite, Zelek the Ammonite, Naharai of Beeroth, the armor-bearer of Joab the son of Zeruiah, Ira the Ithrite, Gareb the Ithrite, Uriah the Hittite, 37 in all.
Why, thank you for doing that. And I noticed that he didn't say Gileonite. He said something else for this name here. Kind of interesting, because this is also the ESV version. Maybe he made a mistake, but that would have been the exact same way I would have pronounced every one of those names. So to see, I just want to see how well he would have done that. Okay. All right, going back to the New American Version. We did all that. And that concludes already chapter 23. So it doesn't take long, does it? Let's go to 24. And we can put this back up here. We're done with all that stuff over there. All right, David's census. The plague. This is interesting. You have to kind of catch this one, look real closely to catch what's going on. the Lord's out of nowhere, and this is where it's interesting, because it's like the Lord's anger against Israel flared again, and you're kind of like, why? But it's almost like something that was just not able to be inserted into 1st and 2nd Samuel, and so they wanted to make sure it was still in there, and somehow the story gets placed at the end of the chapter of the book. So the Lord's anger. Let me see. There's a notation to something. I'm just curious about something. Oh, 1 Chronicles. We haven't got there yet. Okay, so the Lord's anger against Israel flared again, and he incited David against them. Go take a census of Israel and Judah. If you do a census without God's permission, it's not a good thing, by far. But at the same time, if God's asking you to take a census, because this happened with Moses, they were about to ready to come into the promised land, and they went ahead and hold on a second. I had to click on something. And they thought they didn't have enough people. They took a census. And so what happens is when you take a census, a lot of times you have to actually do that because you're ready to go into battle. So you want to know who's able-bodied men, if you will, that can go and fight in the war. It's not an uncommon thing. In fact, even our own census here in this nation, that's part of the reason why, but it's more than that. Obviously, we know there's more reasons than that. It's, civil foundations, economy purposes, taxation, realigning the voting lines, and all that kind of stuff. So when God tells him to do this, it brings about an interesting a little story here. So since David was told by God to do this census, the king therefore said to Joab and the leaders of the army who were with him, tour all the tribes of Israel from Dan to Beersheba and register the people that I may know their number. Now check this out, because Joab probably went like, what? Because he knows exactly what this is going to undertake. But Joab replied to the king, may the Lord your God increase the number of people 100-fold for my lord the king to see it with his own eyes. But why does it please my lord to do a thing of this kind? Because, David, I don't want to go out and have to do this job. I'm just ad-libbing, of course. However, the king's command prevailed over Joab and the leaders of the army, so they left the king's presence in order to register the people of Israel. So it gives you a little description here of their travels. Crossing the Jordan, they begin near Aroer, south of the city in Wadi, and turned in the direction of Gad toward Jazer. They continued on to Gilead and to the district below Mount Hermon. Then they proceeded to Dan. From there, they turned towards Sidon. And I mentioned this, actually, I preached this past weekend. Tyre and Sidon is like way up north. It's not the most northern point, but it's way up north. And Jesus visited there. And then going to the fortress, and at that time, it was a Jewish Israelite community, if you will, but at Jesus' time, it was no more. The Syrians kind of took care of that. I will get into that one day too. Going to the fortress of Tyre and coming down, and to all the cities of Hivites and the Canaanites, and ended up in the Negeb of Judah at Beersheba, just as David had foretold. Thus they toured the whole land, reaching Jerusalem after how long? 9 months and 20 days. 9 months and 20 days. So you're looking at 10 months of traveling around. And I'll show you a map real quick. Joab then reported the census figures to the king of the men capable of wielding a sword. There were in Israel 800,000 and Judah 500,000. And that makes sense because Israel had 10 of the 12 tribes. In fact, I'm surprised the numbers weren't even farther apart. But Judah was well founded and built. And so I think Israel was a little scattered in a sense. And Judah had 500,000. So a lower number, but proportionately more if you consider only 2 tribes. And I will show you that map, if Dennis is okay with that. And David's census. And this is the trek they took. And they went all through here, and it says that they went over across the Jordan, and they went down to the south end over here, went up through Rabbah, into the land of Gilead. I don't know why I just did that, because I didn't tell it to. Up on this other side of the Jordan, stop doing that. I am not telling it to do that. Back up. Come on, you can do it. Map program is really slow, kind of depressing. Tell my wife I need a faster computer. No, I'm just kidding. Actually, this works pretty good. Dan, and then side on, way up here, old Tyre. So I guess maybe that was in a different location. I'm not quite exactly sure. A settlement on the mainland near the island fortress of Tyre. Oh, okay, that's interesting. And Tyre became a good large seaport over 3,000 years at the time of 1,000 years before Christ. Echo here, and I didn't really try to do any calculations of how far this was, but it does give you an idea. If it's 50 miles, then you're probably talking about 400 miles or more. Easy. Okay. All right. Now, here comes the fun part. Right. Let's say, afterward, however, David regretted having numbered the people, because he knew that was not something you're really supposed to do. But at the same time, he said that the Lord told him to do this. So he says, I have sinned grievously in what I have done. And this is something that happened with Moses as well. Let's take a notation there. He says, I have sinned grievously what I have done. Take away, Lord, your servant's guilt, for I have acted foolishly. Well, to take away his guilt, the Lord would have to do something to punish David to remove the guilt. That's a lot of times what we feel like we have to do if we have guilt, right? Of course, that's not quite the way it works with Christ anymore, because he took away the guilt. What's left for us is the recompense of the sin, but this is what David asked of God. So when David rose in the morning, the word of the Lord came to the prophet Gad, who is David's seer or prophet, and said this, go tell David, thus says the Lord, I am offering you 3 options. Choose one of them and I will give you that. So we have Monty Hall coming up. You got door 1, door 2, and door 3. And what I mean by that is that this is how he breaks it down. Gad then went to David to inform him, and he asked, should 3 years of famine come before your land, or 3 months of fleeing from your enemy while he pursues you, or only 3 days of plague in your land? Now consider well, what answer am I to give to him who sent me? So it's kind of a tricky question here. You're thinking, 3 years, 3 months, 3 days, And so David answered Gad, I am greatly distressed, but let us fall into the hand of God, whose mercy is great, rather into human hands. In other words, instead of having my enemy come after me for 3 months, he's thinking one or the other. But then we see in the next verse on 15, thus David chose the plague. And in a sense, it didn't necessarily tell us what was going to happen, but 3 days meant a plague. Oh, it does say plague. I'm sorry. So who knows what kind of plague, how severe the plague is going to be. So at that time of the wheat harvest, let's scroll up a little bit, it broke out among the people. The Lord sent plague over Israel from morning until the time appointed, and from Dan to Beersheba, which is what we saw in the whole trek for the census, right? 70,000 of the people died. No, I think William needs back in. Bless his heart. But when the angel stretched forth his hand toward Jerusalem to destroy it, the Lord changed his mind about the calamity and said to the angel causing the destruction among the people, enough now, stay your hand. And here's another, I think William's outside. I can hear the crickets, or the locust. The angel of the Lord was then standing at the threshing floor of Arunah, the Jebusite. And Jebusite was from Jerusalem, because remember, it used to be called Jebus before it was named Jerusalem. And when David saw the angel, because David could see the angel, I'm not sure if Arunah could see him, but when David saw the angel, he was striking, the angel who was striking the people. Arunah, actually, I put this up somewhere else. I wanted to see this. Where did I put it at? Hold on. I want a little bit more explanation than just that simple thing on the right. All right. Araunah, a Jebusite citizen of Jerusalem, also known as Ornan, we'll see him again in First Chronicles. When David offended the Lord by taking the census of the people, the Lord sent a plague to Israel. David saw the destroying angel of Araunah's threshing floor and was told by Gad, the prophet, to build an altar there. Araunah offered the floor as a gift, but David was careful to purchase the floor for the price of 50 shekels of silver. And then we see that there, but in Chronicles it talks about 600 shekels of gold for the site, which may have been the price for the whole property rather than just the threshing floor. And David made offerings and holocausts, and the plague ended. Solomon would later build the temple on the same site, and that's what I wanted to get to. Very interesting. That is where they're going to put the temple, and the temple's in Jerusalem. So that explains why Araunah is a Jebusite from Jerusalem. Okay. And I keep talking about going to Chronicles, but I don't think we go to Chronicles because it's an overlay of what we're already talking about. So I apologize for that. But it is a place we can reference in some certain things. So when David saw the angel striking the people, David said to the Lord, "It is I who have sinned. It is I, the shepherd, who have done wrong. But these sheep, what have they done? Strike me and my father's family." So he feels really bad now because the punishment was the people that David was responsible for, is his kingdom. And so, in a sense, it is his family. I mean, why would his family deserve any punishment more than the people anyways? It was David that did this act, right? So David offers sacrifices. On the same day, Gad, the prophet, went to David and said to him, "Go and set up an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Araunah, the Jebusite." Scroll up. So according to Gad's word, David went up as the Lord had commanded. Now Araunah looked down and saw the king and his servants coming toward him while he was on the threshing floor, threshing wheat, and that's why it's a threshing floor, you're preparing wheat. When he went out and bowed down before the king, his face to the ground. Because I don't think Araunah saw the angel. I think David's the only one that saw the angel. Then Araunah asked, "Why does my lord the king come to his servant?" And David replied, "To build the threshing floor, to buy, if I can get my words right, to buy the threshing floor from you, to build an altar to the Lord, that the plague may be withdrawn from the people." But Araunah said to David, "Let my lord the king take it and offer up what is good in his sight. See, here are the oxen for burnt offerings and the threshing sledges and the yokes of oxen for wood. All this does Araunah give to the king." So he's like, "Hey, you're my king. You can have all this stuff." Well, Araunah then said, "May the Lord your God accept your offering." In other words, I'm giving you all this stuff, offered up, and hopefully God will accept it. Well, David said to him, "No, I will buy it from you at the proper price, for I cannot sacrifice to the Lord my God burnt offerings that cost me nothing." So it's a good little verse if you ever want to talk about giving up something for Lent, and the kids want to go, "I'll give up some nasty food for Lent, and I don't like that anyways." And I said, "Well, see, it's nothing, So David bought the threshing floor and the oxen for 50 silver shekels. Then, and of course, in First Chronicles, it says 600 gold pieces. Then David built an altar to the Lord there and sacrificed burnt offerings and communion offerings. And the Lord granted relief to the land, and the plague was withdrawn from Israel. And that is actually the last words in the books of Samuel. This little extra story. That's how you can kind of see that this is something that was just kind of like tagged on to the end, if you will. Okay. But when we get to Kings, we're going to see David and all that he goes through at the end of his life, and Solomon rising to power. And then, in fact, hold on a second. I was going to show you this too. I'm all full of graphics tonight. Okay. And it's 7:51. I don't know how well you can all see this, but the royal kingdom in this purple section is First Samuel, and then the start of all of Second Samuel. And so we're right here. And then it goes into First Kings chapters 1 through 11. But then it changes into the divided kingdom because Israel and Judah split again. and 1 Kings 12 through 22, and then the rest of and then all of 2 Kings goes all the way into the exile. So just to kind of point out some of the things that you might be able to see in here. I know it's kind of small, but it's really going to be fun to read about is the story of Elijah and Elisha. And so we're going to get into that. And also we see again, the red line here is oh, I can't stand when I don't give her the lineage, if you will, of Jesus Christ through Joseph. And that's why that's always present here. And all these names are coming up through here. Also, you see that you got the northern kingdom of Israel, the 10 tribes, southern kingdom with 2 tribes. We keep talking about that. And then eventually what happens through here in the middle of 2 Kings, Israel goes into exile, fall into the Assyrian power. And then later on, Judah even falls into, as they call it, deportation or exile into Babylonian on 3 different occasions. And so we'll get into that as well in 2 Kings. So that'll be great. And then we'll get into something else after that. We'll go into Ezra. And Chronicles, Chronicles should be listed. Yeah. First Chronicles is up here where my hand is kind of running in the purple section. And then 2 Chronicles starts in the purple and then goes into the divided kingdom, stretches all the way. It stays right with 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. So it's 7 minutes till 8. Y'all want to watch the film? I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a minute. Get a vote? Anybody want to see the? Oh, I got one hand up. Either that or she's hitchhiking. Okay. All right. Sounds good. We'll go ahead and do that then. And hopefully it'll work correctly. Y'all can hear the other things, so I hope you'll hear this. Did the other one go up and did it go down a little bit? I was turning it down to see if it would not be so loud. I don't know. We'll figure it out. All right. So let me share my screen again. I got to share it differently. That's why I had to turn it off anyways. Optimize for video sharing and share. Okay. Give me a thumbs up if you can hear it.
The books of 1st and 2nd Kings, although they're 2 separate books in our Bibles, they were originally written as one book telling a unified story that continues on from the book of Samuel that came before it. So David has unified the tribes of Israel into a kingdom, and God promised that from his line would come a messianic king who would establish God's kingdom over the nations and fulfill the promises made to Abraham. So the book of Kings tells the story of the long line of kings that came after David, and none of them lived up to that promise. In fact, they run the nation of Israel right into the ground. The book is designed to have 5 main movements. The story begins and ends focused on Jerusalem, first with Solomon's reign and the construction of the temple, and then in this last section ending with Jerusalem's destruction and Israel's exile to Babylon. And the story leading up to this tragedy is what makes up the center 3 sections, which explain how Israel split into 2 rival kingdoms, how God tried to prevent the corruption of Israel by sending the prophets, and how exile became the unavoidable consequence of Israel's sin. The book opens with 2 chapters about the kingdom passing from the aging David to his son Solomon. And David's final words to Solomon, they're very similar to those of Moses and Joshua and Samuel to the people. It's a call to remain faithful to the commands of the covenant and to give allegiance to the God of Israel alone. But David's words ring somewhat hollow here, because David and Solomon then go on to conspire how they're going to consolidate this new kingdom through a whole series of political assassinations. It's not off to a great start. Solomon's brightest moment comes when he asks God for wisdom to lead Israel, and he even completes David's dream to make a temple for the God of Israel. Here the story actually stops and describes the design of this temple in detail, just like the tabernacle design in the Torah. There's all these gold and jewels and depictions of angels and fruit trees. It's all symbolism echoing back to the Garden of Eden. It's the place where heaven and earth meet, where God's presence dwells with his people. But no sooner does Solomon finish finish the temple that he makes some really horrible choices and the kingdom falls apart. He starts marrying the daughters of other kings, hundreds of them, for political alliances. And then he adopts their gods and introduces the worship of those gods into Israel. Solomon then accumulates huge amounts of wealth. He builds a huge army. He even institutes slave labor for all of his building projects. Now, if you go back to the Torah and look at God's guidelines for Israel's kings in Deuteronomy 17, Solomon is breaking every one. So by the time that he dies, Solomon resembles Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, more than he does his father David. The next section of the book opens with Solomon's son, Rehoboam, acting just like his father. It's a very sad story of greed and lust for power. He tries to increase taxes for slave labor. And under the leadership of Jeroboam, the northern tribes reject this, they rebel and secede, and form their own rival kingdom. And so now in the story, you have the southern kingdom, Judah, centered in Jerusalem with kings from the line of David, and now this new northern kingdom called Israel, whose capital will be Samaria eventually. Jeroboam also goes on to build 2 new temples to compete with Solomon's temple in the south. He puts a golden calf in each one to represent the God of Israel. The connection to Exodus 32 and the golden calf, it's all quite explicit. From this point on, the story goes back and forth from north to south, tracing the fate of both kingdoms. Each one had about 20 successive kings, and as the author introduces each king, he evaluates their reign by a few criteria. Did they worship the God of Israel alone, or did they promote the worship of other gods? Did they deal with idolatry among the people? And did they remain faithful to the covenant like David, or do they become corrupt and unjust? And according to these criteria, the author finds no good kings in northern Israel, 0 for 20. And then in southern Judah, only 8 out of 20 get a positive rating, which connects to another huge purpose in this book, and that's to introduce the role of the prophets, key figures in Israel's history. So in the Bible, prophets were not fortune tellers. Rather, they spoke on behalf of the God of Israel, and they played the role of covenant watchdogs, which means they called out idolatry and injustice among the kings and the people. They were constantly reminding Israel of their calling to be a light to the nations, that they should obey the commands of the Torah, and so the prophets challenged Israel to repent and follow their God. In these center sections for each king, God then raises up prophets to hold them accountable. And the most prominent prophets are the northern ones, Elijah and his disciple Elisha, right here in the center of the book. Elijah was a wild man of a prophet living out in the desert, and his arch nemesis was the northern king Ahab and his Canaanite wife Jezebel. Together, these two had instituted the worship of the Canaanite god Baal over Israel. And so in a famous story, Elijah challenged 450 prophets of Baal to a contest to see which god was real. So they both build altars and pray to their gods, but only the God of Israel answers with fire. After this, Ahab uses his royal power to murder an Israelite farmer and then steal his family's vineyard. And Elijah again confronts Ahab's injustice, and he announces the downfall of his house. Elijah eventually passes the mantle of his prophetic leadership to a young disciple named Elisha, who asks for 2 times the authority of Elijah. And what's fascinating here is how the author, he's recounted 7 miraculous feats for Elijah, and then he offers stories of 14 acts of power from Elisha. Both prophets were clearly remarkable men, and they played the same role, confronting Israel's kings for idolatry and injustice. And ultimately, they were unsuccessful in turning Israel back from apostasy. In the next section, the northern kingdom is rocked by a bloody revolution started by a king named Jehu, who destroys Ahab's family. And although Jehu was at first commissioned by God, his violence just gets out of control, and it creates the spiral of political assassinations and rebellions from which Israel never recovered. Coup follows coup after Jehu, and each king follows other gods, allows horrible injustice. It all leads up to 2 Kings chapter 17. The big bad empire of Assyria swoops down and takes out the northern kingdom altogether. In the capital city of Samaria, it's conquered, and the Israelites are exiled and scattered throughout the ancient world. Now, chapter 17 is key. The author stops the story and offers this prophetic reflection on what's just happened. He blames the downfall of the northern kingdom on the idolatry and covenant unfaithfulness of Israel and its kings. And so, God has allowed them to face the consequences of their decisions. divisions. The final movement of the book tells the story of the lone southern kingdom. And here we meet some very heroic kings, like Hezekiah, who trusts God when the armies of Assyria come knocking on Jerusalem's door, or Josiah, who discovers this lost scroll of the Torah in the temple. So he starts reading it, he's convicted, and he institutes religious reforms to remove idolatry and Canaanite influences from the land. But Judah is just too far gone. The king, right in between these two, Manasseh, he's the worst by far. So he not only introduces the worship of idol statues into the Jerusalem temple, he also institutes child sacrifice. And so God sends prophets to say, the time is up. Israel has reached the point of no return. The final chapters tell the story of the Babylonian Empire coming to invade Jerusalem, destroy the temple, and carry the people and the royal line of David off into exile. And so the story ends leaving us wondering, is God done with Israel? Is he done with the line of David? Well, the final paragraph zooms about 40 years forward into the exile, and it tells a very odd story. It's about Jehoiakim, a descendant from David, who would have been king if he was back in Jerusalem. And the king of Babylon releases him from prison and invites him to eat at the royal table for the rest of his life, and the book ends. So it's not much, but it's a story that gives a glimmer of hope that God has not abandoned the line of David. So the question now is, how is God going to fulfill his promises to Abraham, to David? How is he going to bless the nations and bring the Messianic kingdom? And to answer those questions, you have to read on into the wisdom and the prophetic books. But for now, that's the Book of Kings.